Any bird can be seen as a UFO, but whether UFO or not, that bird is still a bird. I am Rachel Nelson, or I guess what I mean is that I was Rachel Nelson, but now I am a digital representation of Rachel Nelson. The me that spoke these words is not the me that you hear speaking these words. Between the vast distances of space and perhaps even time that I am consciously speaking and you are consciously listening to me, much has happened. Many representations were made, and I eventually turned into a flying saucer. The John F. Kennedy Space Center lies on Merritt Island in Brevard County on the eastern coast of Florida, just south of the town of Merritt Island. But just as the town of Merritt Island is not itself Merritt Island is not in fact an island at all. It's not even the words Merritt Island, which are used as a name for this place, just as all of the words I am saying right now are used to represent things that the words themselves are not. But more fundamentally, Merritt Island is a peninsula and not an island, and it's a place long predating and therefore existing without any external dependence on the name Merritt Island. It's just that that's what people call it. And really, the Kennedy Space Center used to simply not be there. Not that long ago. Just a few generations ago, it didn't exist at all. The Kennedy Space Center also sits just across the Banana River from Cape Canaveral, where Space Force Base is located, formerly an Air Force base, and the site of Air Force rocket launches already throughout the 1950s. It was from Cape Canaveral that the first U.S. satellite, Explorer 1, was launched in 1958. These two locations are best known for their many space launches since this time, and the role that they played, for example, in the Apollo moon landing missions. Apollo 11, the most well-known space mission in history, was launched from the Kennedy Space Center on Merritt Island, and SpaceX launched their first Starlink satellites from Cape Canaveral in 2019. In 1962, NASA acquired the lands where the center would be built. At this time, much of this land was occupied by wild salt marshes to the north, periodically flooded by the Banana and Indian rivers, and modern citrus farms to the south. And before the late 1940s, Cape Canaveral would have been dominated by sand dunes. Because of the mosquitoes that once swarmed Merritt Island, people mostly avoided living there, specifically North Merritt Island. This area still contained wild salt marshes into the middle of the 20th century. The brackish marshlands were home to broom grasses. The local Dusky Seaside Sparrows used them for shelter and building nests. The Duskies were the most distinctive of the 8 subspecies of the seaside sparrow, a small bird that lives in salt marshes along the eastern coast of North America. The Duskies' distinctiveness came from their black and dark brown feathers, making them much darker in color than other seaside sparrows, not to mention their unique call. The Duskies were endemic to Merritt Island, Cape Canaveral, and some small regions just across the Indian River and near the St. Johns River. And in their heyday, they likely numbered in the thousands. Merritt Island was also inhabited by human hunter-gatherers thousands of years ago, and in more recent times, the I people who formerly inhabited eastern Florida before being decimated by Spanish settlers. But the dusky seaside sparrow likely diverged from other seaside sparrows hundreds of thousands of years ago, at least according to a mitochondrial DNA study that was conducted in the years just after the bird went entirely extinct. If this study is correct, this means that long before humans ever even inhabited North America, the dusky seaside sparrow's ancestors already long inhabited the same broom grasses on Florida's eastern coast. But the duskies' population began to rapidly decline in the 1940s. Eager to develop the land by getting rid of the mosquitoes, mosquito fighters repeatedly sprayed North Merritt Island with DDT, a synthetic pesticide now known for its negative impacts on ecologies and its ability to remain in the environment for decades. Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring, discusses the harms of DDT and other synthetic pesticides in detail. Carson writes, for example, quote, "And the sparrows that flit through the shrubby understory of the woodlands and forage with rustling sounds amid the fallen leaves, the song sparrow and the whitethroat, these too have been found among the victims of the elm sprays." Unquote. This was the first major impact to the dusky seaside sparrow, likely in part by killing off insects they relied on for food, and also by contaminating their food supply. In researching this piece, I relied heavily on A Shadow and a Song, The Struggle to Save an Endangered Species, a 1992 book by Mark Jerome Walters that chronicles in grim detail the slow demise of the dusky seaside sparrow throughout the mid-20th century. NASA, in collaboration with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, caused the duskies' population to further shrink throughout the 1950s and 60s. This was again in large part because of a war waged on the vast swarms of mosquitoes that spawned on North Merritt Island, a constant hassle for Air Force and NASA employees. The marshlands were separated into impoundments using dikes, and these impoundments were then flooded to kill mosquitoes. But this also destroyed the broomgrass habitats that duskies relied on. Another major impact was the building of multiple highways that crisscrossed Brevard County and cut into the nesting grounds and habitats of the few duskies that still remained. A population known as Big Colony, numbering in the dozens, was only discovered by biologist Brian Sharp in 1968 near the St. Johns River and across the Indian River from Merritt Island. This population would disappear in the following decade as its habitat was destroyed by highway construction. Walter's book is largely a history of how NASA and the Fish and Wildlife Service engineered wetlands for their own purposes and without any care for the sparrows at all, while conservationists found their efforts actively squashed at every turn, even as the duskies' population kept shrinking. Walters writes, quote, "A solicitor's opinion confirmed what some people within Fish and Wildlife had silently suspected all along. Ever since 1973, the service had been violating the Endangered Species Act by colluding in destroying dusky habitat. It seemed that nothing less than the sparrow's extinction could put Fish and Wildlife's malversations on legal ground. Then, critical habitat would no longer be designated, for nothing would be left to protect." Unquote. By the 1980s, the dusky population was fewer than 10, and all of the known surviving Duskies were taken into captivity. At first, they were tended to at the Santa Fe Zoological Society, but then they were moved to Discovery Island at Disney World in Orlando, Florida. Formerly Treasure Island, Discovery Island was repurposed as a themed island attraction containing exotic plants and animals from around the world. Here, an attempt to breed Duskies in order to eventually reintroduce them back into their native habitat was undertaken, after previous attempts to do so were actively hindered by the Fish and Wildlife Service in the 1970s. At Disney World, however, the facility was concealed from visitors. The plan was to backcross Dusky males with females of another subspecies, Scott's Seaside Sparrow. In other words, they would crossbreed these two subspecies to produce sparrows with more Dusky genes. These would then be bred with male Duskies to introduce more Dusky genes to each successive generation. While in theory this would have certainly worked, and it even did succeed in producing several sparrows with mostly Dusky genetic makeup, the project was beset by bureaucratic stalling and successive small tragedies. Over the years, each Dusky as well as each Scott's sparrow died. In some cases, this was because of rat infestations. In some cases, the Duskies accidentally killed themselves by panicking and burrowing into crevices that caused the bird's own demise, and others simply died due to old age. The project to try to restore the Dusky sparrow population through backcrossing took many years, slowed by efforts of the Fish and Wildlife Service, so that by the time that a breeding program was underway, all of the Dusky males that survived were already reaching old age. The last surviving one, a male called Orange Band, died alone in captivity on Discovery Island in 1987. Disney World was built at Epcot, which Walt Disney originally slated not to be a theme park at all, but a futuristic utopian city, an experimental prototype city of tomorrow, or Epcot for short. There, people were to live in a futuristic city, but this ultimately didn't happen. Instead, Epcot was turned into a theme park, a place where various spectacular worlds and even representations of our own world are simulated for anyone willing to pay for a ticket to go inside. Discovery Island was designed as a place to showcase the many spectacular marvels of Earth's life, sort of like a zoo. And in this very place, the last individuals of the Dusky Seaside Sparrow literally died. Though still owned by Disney, the island was shut down as an attraction 12 years later in 1999, and it's been closed since, much of it essentially returned to the wild. Meanwhile, Kennedy Space Center and the Cape Canaveral Space Force Base still persist, and they are themselves cultural simulations. Of course, nobody in NASA or the US Space Force say that these places are theme parks or think of them as simulations. They do have real impacts to the local environment, as I've discussed, and the rockets that launch from these places do really launch and really go up into space. So we can say they exist in the external environment and can cause things to happen objectively. But they are also places that are entirely constructed by humans, using large amounts of steel and concrete, as well as entirely maintained by humans for human purposes, and they are both separate from and a replacement for the places where they are built. In order to create these places, humans had to completely alter the place that was there before. And once these places are abandoned by humans, they will lose all human significance, to deteriorate and gradually recombine with local geological and ecological processes. Perhaps someday, some other subspecies of seaside sparrow might evolve around Merritt Island and the St. Johns. On top of the artificial nature of the Kennedy Space Center, it is supported by American visions of dominion over Soviet Russia and futuristic dreams of human space exploration. Yet, as Sarah Scholes argued in her Scientific American article, critiquing human space habitation, which Louise talked about in the pilot of this show, humans aren't well suited for spending long periods of time in space or for living a life on an inhospitable world like Mars or the Moon. And designing and building the infrastructure, spacecraft, and space missions to do so is extremely expensive, while also putting a toll on the Earth's ecosystems and climate. Considering all of these costs, can we really say that the Kennedy Space Center truly represents any realistic vision of a sustainable future? It's not as though the loss of the Dusky Seaside Sparrow or the salt marshes of North Merritt Island and the surrounding regions were the only impacts that humans ever had to North American wildlife. A little over a century ago, the eastern United States was densely populated, with vast flocks of passenger pigeons and Carolina parakeets. Can a person today imagine what it would have been like to see such a U.S., one densely populated by native parrots and flocks of pigeons that stretched for hundreds of miles? I highly recommend Atlas Pro's videos on the various bird and animal species, as well as some subspecies that went extinct in Nearctic North America during the last couple of centuries, and how each was driven to extinction by European settler culture. The various species and subspecies of birds that have disappeared from our skies in recent times invariably disappeared because of human settlers seeking to exploit local wildlife or to develop the land. Birds were hunted to extinction, beset by plagues brought from the Old World through chickens, or killed off simply because their habitats were destroyed through land development. Some of the most spectacular birds of North America went extinct during this period, like the ivory-billed woodpecker and the great auk. One spectacular bird, the imperial woodpecker, found in the western Sierra Madres of Mexico, is thought to be extinct, but is still listed as critically endangered. But if some imperial individuals have survived to this day, then they are legendary, intelligently controlled, flying objects. Under the right circumstances, spectacular birds thought to be extinct may hypothetically even be regarded as UFOs by people that witness them and are unable to identify them. In a 2022 article from The Mirror, Nick Pope was quoted as arguing that human drone technology has become so advanced that drones are now designed to mimic animals. He speculates, therefore, that extraterrestrials, by comparison, might simply use seagulls to spy on us. But in reality, birds themselves are significant on their own terms, without any requirement to think of them in terms of military defense or alien technology. Birds have their own intelligence, strange appearances, flight behaviors, sounds, and effects on terrestrial animals, and they exist external to humans and otherworldly beings. As I've speculated above, some UFO sighting reports are also sometimes explained by people as sightings of birds. This explanation was given by some during the Lubbock Lights flap of UFO reports that happened in the area of Lubbock, Texas, around late August of 1951. One witness reported what he saw was plovers. I have often wondered over the arrangement of light sources in the Carl Hart photos. Could we be seeing a photograph of birds here? This is something I might go into another time. The CIA explanation for the famous Tremonton, Utah film was birds. And watching the Tremonton film, I feel like it could easily be a video of seagulls. But I'm not really an expert on interpreting UFO footage. According to researcher Lauren Gross, NICAP reported that a disc-shaped UFO was witnessed at a launching of a Polaris missile from Cape Canaveral in 1961. The disc was observed through binoculars by aerospace engineer Mark McClelland, among other witnesses, and was also locked onto by the missile tracking system, according to George Eberhardt's UFOs and Intelligence, a Timeline. It is very unlikely, of course, that the Dusky Seaside Sparrow was ever mistaken for a flying saucer, that a flying saucer was ever actually sighted at Cape Canaveral at a missile launch, or that birds are being used by ET to spy on people. But I think it's worth extending my ideas from last episode here. Much like flying sea foam, the Dusky Seaside Sparrow could in theory have on occasion been spotted by humans and remained unidentified to them. It is technically possible for the Dusky to have become a UFO at times. Perhaps they used their seemingly unremarkable nature to their advantage, and even deceived some G-men. Not only that, but the Dusky in their native habitat of broomgrass-laden salt marshes on the eastern coast of Florida can serve as an alternative mythology to that of crashed saucers and alien humanoids. This would be a useful myth, if only to highlight that NASA's massive building projects on Cape Canaveral and Merritt Island, as well as related public works projects to connect these bases to the mainland, played an instrumental role in displacing the Dusky Seaside Sparrow and destroying their entire habitat. I wonder what this must have been like for the Duskies themselves. First seeing their homes and all of their kin disappear while they themselves struggled to survive, and then being carted off by giants to live in captivity. But we know at least that it must have been like something for these once living birds. But whatever the case, the life and experience of the Dusky was not something that interested the US space program or the Air Force during the Cold War, nor even, for that matter, the US Fish and Wildlife Service. As Walters argues, they failed to see the bird, let alone the bird's habitat, as something intrinsically valuable on its own terms. They preferred instead an artificial refuge built for ducks, which could be hunted and then would therefore draw in tourists. NASA, much like most of the American public, likely didn't really even have an awareness of the sparrow until after they had already made huge changes to Merritt Island. While Fish and Wildlife at least preferred ducks over duskies, NASA preferred space rockets. But what makes rockets more important than ancient local sparrows, let alone birds in general? They were living beings, much like any of us. Walters, who grew up in Brevard County, writes, quote, "The transmogrification of Brevard County from a jewel to a trinket is nearly complete. Once the old-timers are gone, there will be little memory of the wild county, the straw and emerald tapestry of North Merritt Island, of the crystal stars set in indigo nights above the St. John's, before lights spilled into it from runaway cities. Worst of all, one day there will be no memory of the black and white shore finch that once lived there. Unquote. The Kennedy Space Center is an environment entirely constructed, a product of human culture, and this was a major factor in the disappearance of the Dusky. While it functions as a space launch, it also functions as a simulation. I don't mean that it's the Matrix, but it is sort of like a holodeck, or even like Disney World. It is an engineered and constructed environment in the external world, in many ways both a figurative and literal representation of human endeavor, set aside for specific human purposes while enriched with both specific and broad representational meanings. Yet not everyone agrees that NASA is the most useful way for the US to invest their money. Even at the time of the space race, writer Kurt Vonnegut famously lampooned, on multiple occasions, the phallic nature of space rockets launched at Cape Canaveral, for example, in a satirical short story about launching seamen into deep space. And poet Gil Scott Heron criticized NASA's Apollo program from a social standpoint in his poem Whitey on the Moon. Yet, despite the critics and satirists of the space program, Kennedy Space Center persists as an American spectacle of rocketry and futuristic space-age culture, even while it is also an artificial replacement for what was once there. The marshes and dunes of the St. John's, Merritt Island, and Cape Canaveral, similar to how rockets separate humans entirely from the surface of the Earth, sometimes even as far away as the Moon, the space spaces from where the rockets launch are separated entirely from the land where they are built. When a person goes to a space base, they find an artificial environment made and sustained by human wherewithal and state funding. Nowadays, rockets launch amid the birds who visit and live on Merritt Island, but before the rockets, there was a much longer age when the Dusky Seaside Sparrow flew there. They were just a sparrow, a small bird notable only as a subspecies endemic to a small region. The Dusky wasn't driven to extinction because they resembled flying saucers. They weren't big, incredibly fast, or able to, say, interfere with electronics. They didn't have telepathic abilities or a habit of abducting people. If anything, they were driven to extinction because they did not resemble flying saucers. I wonder, what secrets has this now lost sparrow taken to the grave? In this case, only the Earth can provide disclosure.